Hello everyone and welcome to our second micro lecture of this module. Today we are going to switch gears and move away from LSD to explore the effects of different types of hallucinogens, including peyote, psilocybin, and PCP. Let's go ahead and get our discussion started with peyote. Peyote is a small type of cactus that grows in little ball shapes called buttons. The buttons are really considered the crown of these cacti, and they can be used to brew tea, or you could chew the cactus for its effects. But either way, peyote is currently considered illegal in the U.S., except if you are a member of a recognized Native American tribe and you're using it for a religious ceremony. Mescaline is the active drug found in peyote, and it is considered a psychoactive alkaloid. These cacti are native to Mexico and the southwestern areas of Texas, where they bloom in the early spring season. These aren't the typical three-limbed cactus that grow big and tall. These instead are short and squatty cacti that grow in a shrub-like form, and they can produce a flower much like you see here in the picture. You need about 300 to 600 milligrams of mescaline to experience any effect. It will take about 20 peyote buttons to get that 600 milligrams of mescaline. You can dry them out, slice them up, chew them, eat them. There is more concentrated mescaline in dried peyote than if you were to simply eat it or brew it. So many times people will dry the peyote out before they make their tea. Peyote will begin to take effect within 30 to 120 minutes, and the hallucinations can last more than 2 hours. So this stuff is a lot less potent than LSD, but can produce a cross-tolerance with LSD. This map shows the more common growing areas for naturally growing peyote. You can see here a lot of it grows in Mexico in the south and in the southwest fringes of Texas. As a cactus, it does prefer to grow in a desert climate, and it thrives on the mountainous areas on this map. However, it is extremely slow growing. On average, it takes about 3 years before you can have a flowering, harvestable plant. This is a different view of the peyote buttons. This picture is showing things in terms of growth from a newly formed button to a completely developed portion of the cactus. This is what would take about 3 years to produce from a single plant. It is not much. Remember that on average, you need about 15 to 16 buttons to produce enough mescaline to feel an effect. Once the plant is mature, you can harvest the buttons and the plant will continue to grow as long as you harvest them properly. Here is an example of a very mature peyote plant that has been growing for several years at this point. Overharvesting has led the peyote plant to be listed as an endangered species. This picture shows how large the buttons actually are. They're much smaller than you think they would be. You can really see the size comparison once they're held in someone's hands. These buttons are in the process of being dried out. Once they are fully dried, they can then be ground into powder. Remember that when they are dried, there is much more concentrated mescaline in the peyote than if it were to be consumed fresh. Here is a look at the dried powder. It's a rather olive green sort of color. This powder can then be brewed into tea. And this is the tea. It's all ready to be consumed. When you eat the cactus raw or cooked, users report an extremely bitter taste that is associated with it. Peyote is so very bitter in nature that it is difficult for some to even keep down. Many first-time users report vomiting after use because of the taste. However, when you brew it into tea, it helps to remove some of that bitterness, as it can be mixed with other herbs or fruits to help temper that bitterness. Regardless of whether you eat or drink the peyote, the mescaline will have a similar effect regardless of consumption. Consuming peyote creates a variety of effects similar to those created by the consumption of LSD. Users report dilation of their pupils, increases in body temperature, anxiety, visual hallucinations, alteration of body images, vomiting, and muscular relaxation. What's interesting about peyote in comparison to LSD is that we don't see the same adverse types of effects with peyote. Researchers have found next to no longer-term effects of peyote use, and flashbacks are nearly non-existent. However, if you were going to experience any long-term effects, it is most likely that you would be already diagnosed with a mental health condition. Peyote does not seem to have physical dependence issues, but there is a potential for psychological dependence. Next up, we have psilocybin, or the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. Psilocybin has been shown to have antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects and has been used in the palliative care for those who are terminally ill. Like peyote, many magic mushrooms are so bitter that people will brew them into tea. However, they can just be eaten. There are over 200 different types of magic mushrooms where psilocybin is naturally occurring. Magic mushrooms produce effects very similar to LSD and peyote, causing the user to experience visual and mental hallucinations, feelings of euphoria, and descriptive spiritual experiences. However, unlike mescaline, psilocybin is capable of providing panic attacks and bad trips. Psilocybin was originally used by scientist Albert Hofmann in his experimentations in the creation of LSD in the 1930s. As part of that process, Hofmann actually ate 32 different types of mushrooms over time, and he recorded his reactions to each type. Psilocybin is currently a Schedule I drug in the US and has been outlawed in many other countries as well. In November 2022, Colorado voters approved psilocybin legalization for those over 21 years of age as long as the mushrooms are purchased at a licensed dispensary. This decision falls in line with many other states and cities, including Washington, D.C., which have already decriminalized psilocybin use. On January 1st, 2021, Oregon became the very first state to actually begin sales of legalized mushrooms. In June 2023, Rhode Island became the latest state to take up psilocybin legislation at the state level for therapeutic use only, though. At the time of this recording, the Rhode Island law has not been completed through the legislative process, but it will be an interesting law to follow. So what is this suggesting? That magic mushrooms might very well be the new marijuana. It's following a very similar pathway to legalization despite federal laws. There are both recreational and medicinal laws being passed here. There is precedent for the state's decision to sell at licensed dispensaries as long as it is regulated. It will be interesting to follow other states' efforts in this endeavor. So as I mentioned before, psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. The most common mushrooms found in the US are rather small, brown mushrooms like the ones that are shown in this picture. There are certain concerns associated with cross-tolerance between psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline. Remember what cross-tolerance means. When you take one drug for a while, you build tolerance to that drug. Then, when you take a similarly structured drug, you already have a tolerance to the drug based on your prior use of the other substance. The body's responses to psilocybin are similar to those found in the other drugs we've already discussed. So I'm going to somewhat skip this section as we've discussed it twice already. But psilocybin stimulates our nervous system, dilates our pupils, increases body temperature, and causes the hallucinogenic effects that we've discussed earlier. This is a map of all the areas where psilocybin-based mushrooms are growing. There are 53 different varieties that are naturally growing in Mexico, 22 different varieties native to the US and Canada, 16 naturally growing throughout Europe, 15 in different Asian countries, 4 in the African continent, and 19 that are native to Australia and its barrier islands. These mushrooms thrive in wooded areas that have rich soil bases in humid areas. Remember, we are dealing with a fungus here, so anything that has a humid climate would work perfectly. They also need rich soil that comes from well-fertilized areas. In the US, it is not unprecedented to find magic mushrooms growing in cow pastures. Cow dung is rich in nitrogen, and pastures are often ideal places for moist conditions, ideal for growing mushrooms. The perfect time to look for these mushrooms is right after a heavy rainfall. However, I don't encourage you to go hunting for these mushrooms, as poisonous varieties also thrive in these environments. If you don't know what you're looking for, you might mistake a poisonous mushroom for a magic one. So in other words, don't try this at home, kids. Our last drug of the day is phencyclidine, or PCP. We call this one angel dust. Manufactured as an anesthetic, it was a very successful drug for that regard, but they noticed that when the patients woke up, they were starting to exhibit schizophrenia-like symptoms, so they chose to discontinue it for that purpose. For that fact alone, it is considered by many experts as one of the most dangerous of the hallucinogens. Developed as an intravenous anesthetic, but it was found to have serious adverse side effects. Then they used it as a veterinary anesthesia because it wasn't having the same effect on animals. It is a Schedule II drug, but it is currently not being manufactured legally. All of the PCP that is currently produced in the US is being done so illegally. It is cooked in makeshift labs, and it can be cooked pretty quickly. Then they can disassemble the lab. It comes in a liquid format, and then all they got to do is dry it out into powdered form. This is a picture of PCP in powder form. As we know, once something is in powder, then then its possibilities are endless. So how is PCP administered? It can be administered orally, smoked, sniffed, or even injected. The high lasts about 4 to 6 hours, and there is normally a come down time of about 6 to 24 hours. So the effects are lasting for a bit of time here. How does PCP affect you? Some of the regular hallucinogenic effects are still there, but this one can result in an overdose of sorts. Sometimes people who use PCP will sit and stare into space for a while. They're not really blinking, they just sit there and they'll just be staring. But their eyes are not necessarily affected, so their pupils will remain the same, but the stare will be present. Remember that this was originally intended to be an anesthetic, so higher doses can cause coma, convulsions, or even death. But what's interesting and different about PCP is the feeling of strength that it gives you. PCP doesn't give you super strength, but it does make you feel as though you have it. It also makes you think that you can fight someone maybe bigger, taller, stronger than you, and then all of a sudden you get laid out. So there is a false sense of power and invulnerability occurring when PCP is being used. Most people take PCP in groups rather than as a solitary event. So if you're taking the drug and you're hallucinating around all of these people, it would make sense that you may become violent or get into an altercation with someone that you're taking the drug with. Remember that earlier I stated that PCP was originally created as an anesthetic drug, but the patients were waking up exhibiting symptoms that were schizophrenic in nature. That still happens when you take the drug recreationally. Today's second micro lecture focused on drugs similar to LSD, but different in many ways as well. Although there are many more hallucinogenic drugs than the ones we discussed today, these are some of the most frequently used ones in the US. In the next module, we're going to shift gears a little bit and turn back to drug laws, drug use, regulation, and how legalized substances are used here in the US. I'll see you back here next time.